The cold wind howled through the city streets. People hurried by, wrapped in thick coats, their heads down against the chill. Inside a small diner, the warm glow of lights flickered through the windows. The scent of fresh coffee and grilled food filled the air. The door creaked open. A man stepped inside. His clothes were old and worn, his shoes scuffed and damp. His hair was unkempt, and his face looked tired. He glanced around nervously, pulling his tattered coat closer to his body. Some customers turned to look at him. A few exchanged glances, whispering to one another. Others frowned or ignored him completely. He hesitated before making his way to an empty booth in the corner. The diner buzzed with conversation, but the man sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He seemed uncertain, almost as if he didn't belong there. A waitress noticed him. Unlike the others, she didn't look at him with judgment or pity. Instead, she grabbed a menu and walked toward him with a warm smile. "Good evening, sir," she said kindly. "Can I get you something to eat?" The man hesitated, lowering his gaze. He reached into his pockets, but they were empty. The man sighed, his fingers brushing against the inside of his empty pockets. His face showed hesitation, a mix of embarrassment and uncertainty. He looked up at the waitress, his eyes tired yet kind. I don't have any money," he said softly. The waitress didn't flinch. She didn't look annoyed or frustrated. Instead, her smile remained warm. "That's okay," she said gently. "Are you hungry?" The man nodded slowly, as if unsure whether to accept her kindness. She placed the menu on the table but didn't wait for him to choose. "How about a warm meal and some coffee? On the house." His eyes widened slightly. I don't want to be a burden," he said. The waitress shook her head. "You're not a burden. Just sit tight. I'll be right back." She turned and walked toward the kitchen. Meanwhile, the other customers had taken notice. A man in a business suit scoffed, shaking his head. An older woman whispered to her husband. A young couple glanced at the man, then looked away uncomfortably. The diner was full of people, yet the kindness in the room seemed to come from only one person. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with a steaming plate of food, eggs, toast, and a side of crispy bacon. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him, along with a small dish of sugar and cream. "There you go," she said cheerfully. "Eat up." The man stared at the plate, the warmth of the food rising in soft curls of steam. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the fork. He took a bite, slowly at first, then another. The food was hot and comforting, each bite filling the emptiness in his stomach. He swallowed and looked up at her. His voice was quiet but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," the waitress simply smiled. "Enjoy your meal." She turned and went back to her work, wiping tables and taking orders, as if nothing unusual had happened. But to the man, it wasn't just a meal. It was dignity. It was kindness. And it was something he hadn't felt in a long time. As the man ate, the quiet murmurs in the diner grew louder. Some customers stole glances at him. Others whispered behind their hands. A man in a business suit shook his head, setting down his coffee with a sharp clink. "Unbelievable," he muttered to no one in particular. "Giving free food to someone who won't even pay." A woman at a nearby table glanced over, then looked away quickly. Her husband sighed, stirring his soup. "That's just encouraging laziness," he mumbled. A young couple sat near the window, their voices low. The woman nudged her boyfriend. "Why would she do that?" she whispered. "It's not like he can tip her." The waitress, clearing a table nearby, overheard the comments but didn't react. She carried on, her steps light and her face calm. Meanwhile, the man kept eating. He wasn't rushing. He chewed slowly, savoring each bite. It was clear he hadn't had a warm meal in a long time. An older gentleman sitting at the counter watched everything in silence. His expression was unreadable. He took a sip of his coffee, his fingers tapping against the rim of his cup. The businessman scoffed again. "Ridiculous," he said louder this time. "She's wasting money on someone who doesn't deserve it." At that moment, the waitress walked past him with a coffee pot. She stopped, her tone light but firm. "Sir, with all due respect, it's just a meal, and it's not wasted." The businessman raised an eyebrow. "And what do you get out of it?" The waitress smiled. "Nothing. And that's okay." She turned away before he could respond, heading back behind the counter. The businessman muttered something under his breath but said nothing more. The young couple exchanged a glance. The woman looked slightly ashamed, as if rethinking her earlier words. The man in the corner, still in his tattered clothes, had heard everything. He didn't say a word, but a small, knowing smile touched his lips. For the first time that night, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't just another homeless man being ignored or judged. Someone had seen him. And that was enough. The man finished the last bite of his meal, setting his fork down gently. He wrapped his hands around the warm coffee cup, letting the heat seep into his fingers. For the first time in a long while, he felt warmth, not just from the food, but from something deeper. The waitress returned, clearing his plate with a smile. "Did you like it?" He nodded. "It was the best meal I've had in a long time. Thank you." She shrugged, as if it was no big deal. Everyone deserves kindness. The businessman at the other table scoffed again. "Kindness doesn't pay the bills," he muttered. "This is exactly why people stay poor, always relying on handouts." The man in the tattered clothes glanced at him but said nothing. Instead, he reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against something, and he pulled it out, a small, folded piece of paper. The waitress watched as he smoothed it out. Her brow furrowed when she saw what it was, a checkbook. She blinked, confused. The other customers noticed too. Whispers spread around the diner. With calm, steady movements, the man clicked a pen and began writing. He didn't rush. He wrote carefully, as if every stroke of the pen carried meaning. Then, he tore the check from the book and handed it to the waitress. She took it hesitantly, her fingers trembling slightly. Her eyes fell to the numbers. Silence. The entire diner seemed to freeze. The amount was staggering, more money than she had ever seen on a check. Her breath hitched. "What is this?" she stammered. The man finally smiled, a small, knowing smile. "It's for you," he said. The businessman, who had been watching with narrowed eyes, suddenly sat up straighter. His face paled. The young couple at the window leaned in, their curiosity turning into shock. The waitress swallowed hard. "I don't understand." The man tilted his head slightly. "You didn't ask for anything in return," he said softly. "That's why you deserve it." Her eyes lifted from the check, looking at him closely. His face, weathered, tired, seemed strangely familiar now. Something clicked in her mind. She gasped. The name on the check. Bill Gates. The entire diner fell into stunned silence. The businessman's jaw dropped. The young couple exchanged wide-eyed glances. The older gentleman at the counter simply nodded, as if he had suspected something all along. The waitress stared at him, her hands gripping the check like it might disappear. You're... She couldn't even finish her sentence. Bill Gates smiled again. "Just a man who wanted to see how people treat those who have nothing." Her breath caught in her throat. She had served countless customers in her life, but she never expected this. The waitress stood frozen, her fingers gripping the check as if afraid to let go. Her heart pounded in her chest. The name written in neat, bold letters was clear. Bill Gates. She lifted her eyes slowly, staring at the man she had assumed was homeless, his worn-out clothes, his tired expression. None of it made sense now. The diner remained completely silent. Every customer was in shock. The businessman who had mocked her earlier sat stiffly in his chair, his face pale. The young couple near the window exchanged nervous glances. Even the older gentleman at the counter, who had watched everything unfold, gave a small, knowing nod. Finally, she found her voice. This isn't real," she whispered. Bill Gates chuckled softly. "It's real." Her breath hitched. "But why?" His expression turned thoughtful. "I wanted to see how people treat others when they think no one is watching," he said. "Most people only show kindness when there's something in it for them." Her eyes welled with tears. "I didn't do it for anything," she said, her voice shaking. "I know," Bill Gates said. "That's why you deserve this." The businessman finally spoke, his voice tight. This is insane," he muttered. I didn't know." Bill Gates turned to him. His gaze was calm but sharp. "You didn't know because you didn't care," he said simply. "You judged without knowing the full story." The businessman opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face burned with embarrassment. Meanwhile, the waitress wiped her eyes quickly, still unable to process what was happening. I don't know what to say," she admitted. Bill Gates smiled. "Then don't say anything. Just keep being who you are." She looked down at the check again, her hands trembling. It wasn't just the money. It was what it represented. Someone had seen her kindness, someone had valued it. Other customers, who had ignored or judged the situation before, now looked at her with admiration. The young woman at the window whispered, "She really deserves it." The businessman, still flustered, cleared his throat and reached for his wallet. I'd like to leave a big tip," he muttered. To support good service." For the first time, the waitress let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Bill Gates stood up, pushing his chair back. "Thank you for the meal," he said. "It was exactly what I needed." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. As he walked to the door, the diner remained silent, watching him go. No one whispered now, no one sneered. The waitress looked down at the check one more time, then held it close to her chest. This night had changed everything. The door swung shut behind Bill Gates, leaving the diner in stunned silence. The waitress stood still, the check clutched tightly in her hands. Her mind raced, struggling to process what had just happened. The businessman, who had been mocking her moments ago, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He cleared his throat. "Well, I guess I misjudged things." His voice was quieter now, almost ashamed. The young couple by the window whispered between themselves. The woman, who had doubted the waitress earlier, now looked at her with admiration. "That was incredible," she said softly. The older gentleman at the counter smiled knowingly. "Kindness always finds its way back to you," he murmured before taking another sip of his coffee. The waitress finally exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. She looked down at the check again, her hands still trembling. It wasn't just about the money, it was about what it meant. Someone had noticed her. Someone had appreciated her kindness when no one else did. The businessman, perhaps trying to redeem himself, pulled out his wallet and placed a large bill on the table. "For the service," he muttered before hurrying out of the diner. One by one, the other customers who had once judged the homeless-looking man now looked at the waitress with respect. A few even left extra tips before leaving. The young couple stayed a moment longer. The woman hesitated before speaking. "You reminded me that kindness doesn't need a reason," she admitted. "Thank you for that." The waitress gave her a small smile, still overwhelmed. "I was just doing what felt right." The woman nodded. "And that's exactly why it mattered." As the diner emptied, the waitress finally sat down, feeling the weight of everything. The check in her hands still felt surreal. She had worked long hours, struggled through difficult days, and had never once expected anything in return. But tonight, her kindness had come back to her in a way she never could have imagined. She didn't know what she would do with the money yet, but she knew one thing: she would never stop being who she was. She glanced toward the door where Bill Gates had walked out minutes ago. A soft smile touched her lips. Not all wealth was measured in money. Some came in the form of kindness.